Welcome to the Rockabye Revenue Podcast with me, Abby Watson. I'm a mum of 4 and a business strategist, and I train people to become hypnobirthing teachers. In the last decade, I've built a thriving baby business that grew beyond my wildest dreams. This podcast is for you if you run a business or dream of running a business in the birth and baby industry. You want to change lives whilst making more money. I'm talking about creating sustainable income whilst being present for the people that matter most. I believe for our baby businesses to have the impact we desire, we must be rewarded. On this podcast, expect me to share actionable strategies without the jargon. I've been where you are. I've built a business while raising 4 little ones, and now I'm here to help you turn your passion into profit while creating the life you've always dreamed of. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Rockabye Revenue. This is a juicy one because I am taking you behind the scenes of my very recent podcast launch. This very podcast, I'm going to be telling you all about all the things that went wrong. I'm also going to be sharing some very big lessons that I received that I want you to receive too when launching this podcast. Now, this is going to be important to you whether or not you ever decide to launch your own podcast. These lessons are transferable to any blooming thing new you do in your business. So this is absolutely one to listen to. And if you are listening to this on the day that it is released, it's Christmas Eve. So Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. I hope you have a lovely, lovely, lovely time. I will be on this day, Christmas Eve, I'll be doing my annual bowling trip with my children, followed by a Christmas Eve box and some nice food and me getting ready for the big day, Christmas. We host Christmas, so yes, there'll be lots of me, probably a bit stressed, trying to set the table in advance and all that capers. So anyway, let's crack right on. So as you probably know, because you are one of my wonderful listeners to this podcast is relatively new. It launched at the start of November. It was a long time coming. I've been talking about launching a podcast for a little while, but I wanted to make sure I'd freed up some space in my business to really commit to it. So that's what I did. It closed down. Well, I didn't actually close down. I handed a Facebook group over to the wonderful Samantha Bevington, where I was spending a lot of my time. So I let go of that group to have time to do this podcast, because sometimes we've got to let go of things to make space for new things. And I'm so glad I did it. But my goodness, that few weeks when I was launching this podcast, oh my God, there was some right stresses. And maybe on the outside, it looked shiny and hugely successful with loads of positive feedback. And that's exactly what, we got, loads of positive feedback. But behind the scenes, my gosh, there was some major disasters. And I'm going to be sharing the lessons, what's and all today. Okay. So firstly, I want to start with the huge positives. And just letting you know what an unbelievable thing launching this podcast has been for me and my business. I'm so glad I did it. It has been wonderful and I have received the most incredible feedback. And if you are one of those people that took the time to message me, to voice note me, to tag me on Instagram, oh my gosh, literally, you don't even know how much I needed that, because it was challenging. So receiving that wonderful feedback, oh my gosh, made it so worth it. and put the joy in a time where I felt like, oh, what have I done doing this? So a massive, massive thank you. And if you're yet to, share any feedback back, please do drop me a review on this podcast. It always really helps and absolutely makes me, my family, do a big happy dance. So yeah, please, please, please do leave a review if you haven't already. So firstly, it was a huge success, more than I could have ever hoped for. The feedback was just incredible, and people that haven't been in touch with me for a while got back in touch and said how much they needed this podcast, which was just so wonderful. There was new people that came into my world, and yeah, it's just been incredible in terms of the impact it's had on other people. And I'm definitely at a stage where I'm enjoying recording these episodes so much. They are definitely the highlight of my week, sitting down to record this podcast. Love, 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 love doing that. Okay. Also, oh my gosh, the podcast got to number 15 in the podcast charts for business, which is a hugely competitive area. I mean, my goodness, there's people like Stephen Bartlett in that, So that was just such a huge win. And yeah, it literally had me beaming. But I did have to check myself a little bit, because even though there was all this good going on, because there was lots of stressful things going on and things that I perceived to be things going wrong, I had to remind myself of all the positive stuff, because it is so easy to get consumed with the bad stuff, right? And as I record this episode, 6 weeks on from the launch, some of the things that felt so awful at the time, I now look back and I'm like, why did I even let it get to me so much? But that's what happens sometimes, isn't it? We want in this thing to be this huge, wonderful thing. And when things go wrong, it feels like awful, awful, awful. So let me take you behind the scenes and share some of the things that went wrong. Okay, now firstly, I'm going to start with something that you might resonate with massively. I massively underestimated how time consuming it was going to be, So previous to this, I was creating content regularly. I was going live in a Facebook group. I was, planning valuable content like I do for this podcast. So I was doing that in a Facebook group. And in my head, I was simply doing the same thing, but in another way, with a mic, with a mic, recording it on a different platform. What was going to be hard about that? Well, my gosh, I totally underestimated. And I don't know why, because I am number one technophobe over here. I totally underestimated how time consuming it is when you are using a new platform. So I had taken lots of people's recommendations in terms of the platforms that I was going to use. And, I'd been assured they were very straightforward to use. And, they had all the tutorials on there. And it was just a matter of pressing a record button and, getting started. What could be hard about that? Well, oh my gosh, it was tricky. It's not now. Now I literally plug my mic in and I press the record button and I go for it. And then I press the stop button and I even know magic buttons to press to edit it. Okay. When I first got on this platform, well, I didn't even know whether I was recording. I was pressing the recording button and then I was like, is it? And then I was like, how do I leave it? How do I stop the recording? And then when I stop it, where does the recording go? Has it disappeared? Like, oh my gosh, it was super, super stressful. I was even like, where do I even look when I'm recording? Because some of you may know that when I'm recording the podcast, I'm also videoing it so that it can go on YouTube. I know some of you watch over there. Hello, YouTube watchers. So I'm recording it as well. So, you know, as much as it sounded easy talking into a mic, because I'm videoing it as well, I'm like, where am I supposed to be looking? Should I be looking at the mic? Should I be looking at the camera? What should I be doing? And those things that sound like so simple and straightforward, oh my God, felt overwhelming. Okay. I'm recording an episode, okay, was taking me ages. Knowing what to do if I made an error, you know, was really complicated, or I was overcomplicating it. And to start a successful podcast, it's really recommended that when you launch with several episodes in one go. So it was recommended that when I launched my podcast, I'd have at least 3 episodes going live on that first day, with another episode coming out later that week. So I needed at least 4 episodes for that very first week. Okay. And oh my gosh, that took a long time. Now, I am very lucky that at this point in my business, I do have people helping me. So I did have people helping me take the podcast, my edited version, and putting it on a platform. But of course, this was new to them too. So again, super, super time consuming. And right until, you know, the day it was launching, we were still faffing about with things behind the scenes. And there was still this feeling of, have we done it right? Is it going to go live on the day, you know? And let me take you to the second thing that went wrong. It didn't go live on the day. So literally, I had been recommended that, you know, to start this podcast with a bang, you want to really build it up. And that's what I'd been doing. You know, I'd really been building it up. This podcast's coming soon. Do you want to be the first person to hear about it? All that kind of stuff. It had been suggested that I create some kind of closed community with like my cheerleaders in, so kind people that were happy to, you know, be the first listeners. And, you know, those of you that are still listening that were those people, forever grateful. So I had this WhatsApp group with all you lovely people in, and I was saying the podcast's coming tomorrow morning. And then tomorrow morning came and I woke up and I, of course, went over to Apple Podcasts and it wasn't there. The podcast wasn't there. It was supposed to have gone live at 4 a.m. in the morning and it wasn't there. So of course I went over to Spotify. Was it there? No, it wasn't there. The podcast wasn't there. So this was 6 a.m. in the morning with 4 children to get ready for school. And I was like, oh my God, where is this podcast? Why is it not there? So I went to the podcast distribution, you know, this podcast distributor, Podbean, that I've been using, and looked why it wasn't there. The episodes were there, set to be released, but they hadn't been released, but I couldn't see why. You know, it said that they were supposed to be released at 4 a.m., but they weren't. And I could have pressed a button to release them, but I was scared that would do something to damage what was going on, you know? Because when you press the release button, the individual platforms can check what you've released. So I didn't know whether this was going to mess it all up and delay it even further. So I was scared. And then I had people in the WhatsApp group, of course, being like, oh, is it here? And I was like, oh my God, what do I even say? Because I don't even know why it's not there or what I can do about it. So I, of course, got the kids to school feeling hugely stressed, and then took a closer look and realised that the reason it hadn't gone live was because, oh my gosh, because the podcast distributor was in a different time zone. So even though we'd put that it should be released at 4 a.m, that was Canadian time. And it wasn't yet 4 a.m. in Canada. So, yeah, that's why. So a massive, little error we'd made, and that's why it wasn't there. So, of course, I adjusted that, pressed live, pressed for it to be released, and eventually it was released, but not on Spotify, which is ultimately where a huge chunk of people listen to podcasts. Now, let me tell you what happened next, but before I do so, we're going to pause for a quick ad break. So I shall see you in a moment. Don't go anywhere. If you've ever considered training to become a hypnobirthing teacher yourself, I have the perfect opportunity for you. This January, I am hosting a free 3-day free training just for you. This training will help you explore what being a hypnobirthing teacher is like, what you actually do, how to be an incredible one, and how to attract clients. We start on the 27th of January for 1 hour each day. Finishing our training on Wednesday the 29th, you will learn so much, leave so inspired, and really importantly, have clarity on this rewarding path. If you'd like to reserve your spot, please do save your space in the show notes. You'll see the link there, or come over to my Instagram and DM me free training and I'll send you all the details. I'd love to see you there. Welcome back to this episode all about the flops, the failings, the bad things that happened in the launch of this very podcast. So, I was telling you that the podcast didn't go live when it was supposed to. I had all these wonderful people waiting to be the first listeners to rate it, to review it, and it wasn't there. And I worked out why, sorted it out, and it went live, but not on Spotify. And of course, there were people asking, can't find it on Spotify. Of course they were, because I'd said it would be on Spotify. It's so important that it's on Spotify. Most people, or a huge chunk of people, do listen on Spotify. So I had to blooming work out why these episodes were not making their way to Spotify. And oh my God, we could not work it out. We could not work out why it was not getting to Spotify. The podcast distributor, it was looking like it was going to Spotify, but it was not getting there. And you might be thinking, well, people can listen other places. Yeah, they can. But the very first week you launch something like a podcast, it's so important that it is super easy for people, because those initial listening figures, those initial downloads, those initial reviews matter so much, because that's what helps the algorithm know that this is a podcast worth putting in front of other people, And I'd done everything I could possibly do to create, this kind of excitement for it. And then it just wasn't there for them. So it felt hugely stressful. And I don't know about you, but when it comes to stresses with technology, the frustration feels even more intense, because when you can't work out technology, it just feels like a bit of an impossibility, doesn't it? So, of course, I was in this wave of like stress, thinking, how am I going to get it on there? How can I work it out? Like, what can I do? I was messaging Podbean. I was looking at YouTube videos that, might give me some clues on this. But of course, whilst all this is happening, life is also happening, I've got 4 children. I've got some really challenging kids, kids that really do need that extra support. And my head was in a mess, like really like stressing about these little details. So quite frankly, that week I was simply in fight or flight all week. I really was. I was drained with it. And I was up in adrenaline mode, like struggling to think clearly and struggling to enjoy the success that had come in that first day, despite the problems, because I was so blooming stressed about why it wasn't reaching Spotify. And of course, when that happens, you go into like, what's the word? Like catastrophizing mode. I was like, what if I never get it on Spotify? That's a whole audience that isn't able to access it easily. Oh my gosh, it's just missing out on that stream of possible downloads. So yes, it was stressful. Anyhow, I worked out why it wasn't getting to Spotify. It wasn't getting to Spotify because we had uploaded it as an MP4, as in it was video as well as audio. Because you might know that if you listen on like Apple Podcasts, you can watch a video of some people's podcasts as well. Well, I didn't know that if you do that, Spotify just rejects it because they only want you to use video if you are using their distribution tool. And I didn't know that. And, we'd not had any kind of like error message or any notification that was going to happen. So we worked it out, but then I was in this difficult position of being like, oh gosh, the first 4 episodes are not going to be on Spotify, unless I take down the episodes off everything and start again. But so many people had downloaded, had rated, had reviewed, and it was just going to potentially mess all that up. So I made the decision that I wasn't going to tamper with it. I didn't want to tamper like the good stuff that had already happened. So, as you might know if you are one of the Spotify listeners, the first 4 episodes are not on Spotify, and that is why. And maybe later down the line we may dare to replace those episodes on everything, taking out the video side of it so that it goes onto Spotify too. But right now, I don't want to tamper with the algorithm. I don't want to potentially make a bigger headache for myself. Okay. Now, what was the lesson there? Well, the lesson there was, like me talking about it 6 weeks on, I really think to myself, like, why did I let that stress me so much? Like, why was I so worried? And I know why. I wanted it to go so well, and I didn't want to let people down. And I was so worried that people that I promised, that they could listen on Spotify would just be like, oh, well, I can't listen. And not listen when they could benefit from this podcast so much. But now, 6 weeks on, I can see it with more rational eyes, and I can see that actually, it did sort itself out. I was able to say to those people, look, I'm really sorry. From episode 5, it will be on Spotify. But for now, are you okay to watch on YouTube? And of course, people understood. But the lesson there is, in the moment, things can feel so big when actually we can work everything out, Nothing is usually that devastating that we can't work it out. And yeah, everything with a reasonable explanation and a bit of sorting out can be sorted. And later on, we do think, oh my gosh, why did I get so stressed about that? So yeah, that was absolutely the lesson there. And, if you are ever in a position of doing something new and you feel like, oh my gosh, this is a disaster, just remember in a few weeks, it won't seem a disaster. You'll have found a way. And you'll look back and you'll be like, okay, I can see why I freaked out. But I want to remember for next time that, little things can become big things and eventually they go back to little things, So that was that. And the final thing that felt really cringy, to be honest, was when a few people noticed, I didn't even know this, so I should say they told me that the first episode had 2 intros on. So it had a minute intro and then it repeated the same minute intro again. And quite frankly, when people told me that, I didn't just think, no big deal. I felt like, oh my God, I look so amateur. People will think I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, how unprofessional. This just looks such a mess. And it felt very big and very embarrassing. And I almost felt like I needed to delete that episode, because it felt a bit embarrassing and shameful that I'd done it wrong, that it had gone out not perfectly, And can you see how that sounds? It sounds utterly ridiculous, doesn't it? That small thing made me feel like deleting everything and apologizing to the world because it wasn't perfect. But of course, nobody minded. They were giving me a heads up. They weren't complaining, and I knew that. But isn't it funny how our perfectionism can come in and we can almost feel embarrassed of these little errors that nobody's judging us for, But again, we're making something so little feel so big. And also on that note, it also is that reminder that when there's been a few things that feel like that wasn't meant to happen, it can feel hugely stressful because it's this build up, it's this cumulative effect, So those are the things that went wrong and left me, to be honest, utterly drained after the launch of my podcast. Drained with the joy of it, when we're excited, when we're all on, having to promote, that in itself is draining. But as well, because it had put me in this fight or flight of how do I sort this out? What do I need to do? This is not going right. I was utterly drained. And that's probably why I went into absolute overwhelm afterwards. And you may have listened to my previous episode on that very overwhelm and how I needed to take some time away. And that's what I did. I had a week completely away from my business where I didn't touch anything. And it was much needed and it really helped me just get back into that headspace and then be able to celebrate so much how blooming wonderful the launch had been. Now, before we go, I want to share something that you can absolutely learn from for your own business. Now, one really positive lesson that I received from the launch of this podcast was this. it always makes sense to create a hype before we do something. And we often do this, don't we, when we first launch our business, So if you're a hypnobirthing teacher, perhaps when you were first starting your business, you made a big fuss, you quite rightly, banged the drum for what was coming. Maybe if you're a baby massage teacher, you did that too. Or you added something to your business. You made this big, this is coming soon. Can you help support me in this? And then we stopped doing that, And this podcast launch really reminded me the power of calling upon your helpers, your cheerleaders, the people in your life that want to see your business thrive, that are willing to help you, Because, like I said earlier in the episode, when launching this podcast, I did start banging the drum for it before it was released. Like the movie trailer before a movie, and let people know it was coming. And then, quite uncomfortably, this did feel uncomfortable for me, I asked people if they'd be happy to come into a private WhatsApp group. And within that WhatsApp group, I asked, again, it felt pretty uncomfortable, I asked people if they would be willing to listen on that first day, if they'd be willing to share on social media the podcast, if they'd be willing to rate the podcast. I asked, and it did feel uncomfortable. But my goodness, do you know what was so incredible? Just how willing people were to do that, They were so willing to cheer me on. And that was so, so wonderful. And you know what? Nearly 10 years into my business, it was that nice reminder that, I've built something really special and there's a wonderful community of people around me, because sometimes you can lose sight of that when you're running an online business, So that's your reminder that if you are doing something new in your business, maybe it's adding another service to your business, or maybe it's starting a podcast yourself, or maybe it's the launch of a new version of your course, or maybe you're writing a book. It might feel uncomfortable calling upon your cheerleaders. It might feel like something that's a bit outside your comfort zone. But oh my gosh, there are people there ready and waiting and wanting to support you in it. Use those cheerleaders. Create that buzz. Sometimes we have to. We have to be the fuel behind that buzz. We can't just expect that it'll magically happen. We have to lead that. And we might do that when we start our business. But if you're a year in, 2 years in, remember you can still utilise that tool even now. So I do hope you have enjoyed this episode, I can't get my word out, episode of Rockabye Revenue. I hope that you take some comfort, perhaps, that, behind what looked like an incredible launch, and it was, there was some major stresses. It wasn't plain sailing, but my goodness, we can get through those times, and we learned so blooming much from the things that feel tricky. So next time I am here talking to you, and it's going to be on New Year's Eve, really quite fittingly, we're going to be talking about some of the bigger things you could do in 2025. Not just posting on social media. Yeah, carry on doing the things that are working for you. But what bolder things could you be doing that could have some big impact that might not even take you very long? So, have a wonderful, wonderful holiday time, and I shall speak to you really soon. Take care. Thank you for listening to Rockabye Revenue. I hope this episode has left you with some fresh ideas and bundles of motivation. If you enjoyed this episode, do make sure you click subscribe so you never miss an installment. And if you found this episode useful, I'd love you forever if you leave a 5-star review, helping this podcast reach the ears of more of the helpers in this world. And remember, keep changing lives. See you next time.